Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here, and I've thoroughly enjoyed today, so thank you for the invitation. And I invite you just to listen for just a minute, actually a few seconds. So what did you hear? You probably heard some of the man-made sounds. I'm sure you recognize the car starting, perhaps a fan blowing. But did you catch the insects, the sounds of the insects? You did, the buzzing and usually the ones that bite us, right? We're familiar with that. But we have a voracious appetite for energy, and I don't need to stand up here and tell you that. And it's only expected to increase. But what I'd like you to consider is the fact that we're surrounded by natural forms of energy. And actually right now, if you were to stop and count them, there are about 10 quintillion individual little natural biorefineries on the planet, and you probably know them as insects. And so the 10 quintillion comes from, if you were to just think about how many are alive on the planet right now, those are the estimates that you come up with. And so what I'd like you to think about even further, and what's more astounding to me even, is that for each one of those quintillion, associated with it is at least one, and sometimes more than 100 different types of microorganisms. So if you think about what that number would look like, I didn't even bother to put it up there, just cover the screen in zeros. So you may be thinking, well, what do these microbes do? What do the microorganisms do? Well, in the case of the bean bug, it actually is the microorganisms inside the animal that allow it to become pesticide resistant, that allow it to evade our means of trying to get rid of this pest. And in the case of the digger wasp, shown here in the cocoon form, the insect has to stay in this life form for several months, and it cultivates bacteria to live on the surface, and those bacteria produce antibiotics that protect the animal. And a third interaction with insects and microorganisms is what Todd alluded to, and that's the microorganisms that actually help the animal produce the energy that it needs. And so that's what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, is what are some of the lessons that we can learn from how nature transforms energy, and how might we take some of the lessons that we learn and help us advance our industrial processes even further. So I want to just give you an example of cellulosic ethanol, just as one type of industry. Most of us have heard about ethanol. Most of us have heard the term cellulosic or lignocellulosic. And I don't have time to go into a lot of detail here, but if you think about the step one there, that is the collection and the harvesting of your materials, of course you have to do that in an environmentally aware, sustainable manner. So just give us that, we're all on the same page there. So your process might be to plant a crop like we do with trees, we farm trees here, or it might be that you use the leftover residue of another process. And so if you look at step number 2, then you might envision taking one of those logs and shoving it into the reactor. And you could do that, they're that big, but really you have to reduce the particle size. So you have to have some chopping or some shredding. And then usually there's a bit of heat that's applied and some chemistry that allows the opening up of that fibrous material so that then the enzymes will come in and they actually start to deconstruct the long chains of carbohydrates. And then the microorganisms can actually take those sugars and produce a product. And in this case, the product is ethanol. But it could be butanol, it could be biojet fuel, it could be lactic acid for bioplastics, it could be any one of a number of products because microorganisms are really resourceful in the kinds of things they produce. Okay, so you may be thinking, haven't I heard this before? So what's different about this? So in fact, the idea of using bio-based materials to make a product or a commodity chemical started really with the Model T. It was designed to run on ethanol, not on petroleum. And when petroleum became available and it was really cheap, then we transitioned away from a bio-based economy to a more petroleum-based economy. And then if you look down just below that, I have a lovely picture of our environment, and that's to remind me that in the 60s, we started becoming very painfully aware of what our industrial processes were doing actually to the planet. And a number of laws were enacted that caused us to perhaps be more conscious of our stewardship of our natural resources. And then up in the corner, you'll see the sign that says, "Sorry, no gas." And if you were around at that time, this was around the 70s and early 80s, where we had the OPEC oil embargo and we had the oil crisis, where gas stations actually ran out of gasoline. They just didn't have any fuel. And so there was quite a bit of chaos that ensued. And throughout these periods in history, we've said, well, let's look for alternatives to petroleum. Let's look for an alternative energy source. And then when OPEC stops yanking our chain or something happens and petroleum becomes cheap again, we kind of abandon that. So what I'd like to share with you is the idea that perhaps for the first time in our history, a number of very powerful drivers, political, environmental, and economic, have aligned themselves to kind of shove us away from petroleum. And so if you think about the first political driver, this is the Secretary of the Navy. And I'd just like to paraphrase something that he was saying at this clean energy conference. And he said, "It makes great strategic sense to move away from fossil fuels. It's costly. For every increase of $1 in a barrel of oil, it costs the US Navy $31 million. And it's costly not just in terms of money. For every 50 convoys of gasoline we bring in, we lose a Marine, killed or wounded, and that's too high a price to pay." So we're finally starting to acknowledge some of the politics and some of the strife around our dependence on petroleum. And it's a matter of environmental impact. And now I need to stop too and say I don't believe that cellulosic ethanol is a silver bullet. I don't believe there's one answer. We need silver buckshot. We need everything that we can do, but everything has a consequence. And if you're going to really go deep down in the earth and start really trying to recover the resources, you're going to have an impact on the environment. And if you think about economic reality, then the investments over the last, I think that graph starts in 1995 and is estimated to go to 2020, the investment in the renewable energy space has really started to explode. So one of the messages that I'd like to convey to you is that we're in this transition now, that it's happening now, that people are making investments because of these drivers aligning themselves today. So let's get back to some of the lessons that we're learning from nature. So I introduced you to the termite earlier. Most of them you've seen before. But this particular insect is called Tupula abdominalis, and it's otherwise known as the crane fly. And it looks like a giant mosquito that's about to suck you dry of all your blood, but it won't do that. And if you look at it for a second, you can tell it's not a mosquito because it can barely control the way it's flying. It's very ungraceful. So I'm here to beg for mercy, and please don't squash it, because it only exists to find a mate and lay eggs, and then it dies. And what we study is the larval stage, shown here, of this insect. And the larvae are very important in stream ecosystems because they're major processes of leaf litter that falls into the streams. And so if you take a look at the larvae, and the drawing just underneath the picture of the larvae is actually an outline of its gut system. And not only does the animal decrease the particle size and the material is collected and harvested in the streams, but if you look at number 2, my industrial process up there, the animal actually provides some chemistry that perhaps we hadn't realized before. So in the animal's midsection, in its midgut, the pH is very alkaline, and some of the toxic kind of compounds that come in with the biomass, they're actually removed, and that's kind of detoxified. And if you do this on an industrial scale, there are processes where you raise the pH up very high and then you drop it back down. That actually makes everything downstream work better. That material's less toxic to the organisms, it's less toxic to the enzymes, and your yields are increased. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if you take a look inside the animal, inside the hindgut, you'll find it's just chock full of microorganisms. And some of the discoveries that we've made in this system have to do with new kinds of enzymes that have different activities that hadn't been seen before in industry. And so if you can apply some of these new enzymes in that industrial process there, maybe they'll go faster, or maybe your yields will be higher. We also found some new sources of antibiotic compounds inside the system. And as you might imagine, it's very crowded in there. And if you can produce something exhibited by the plate on the slide that can keep your competitors labeled 1, 2, and 3 at bay, then that would give you an advantage. And so while this particular example is not a new antibiotic, it's a new source of antibiotics. And finally, we've discovered some completely new organisms. This particular one has a new cell wall type. It has a new way of dividing. And chances are really good that if you look into a system that's not well studied, you're going to find something no one has seen before. So I'd like to maybe finish up by just giving you a couple of examples of some applications of what we've learned from our insect teachers. And this is a picture up in the top corner. You'll see a picture of yeast. And many of us are familiar with Saccharomyces yeast. They're used in baking bread, they're used in brewing beer and making wine, and they're used in corn ethanol. And so we took this industrial strain and we asked it to ferment pre-treated southern yellow pine. And so what happened was what you see at the bottom of the graph in the green line. It didn't do very well. So we learned some lessons from how the insect is able to detoxify this material. And what we did is we evolved a yeast that's now able to ferment this material to much higher yields. And as you might imagine, that this process is greatly enhanced economically. You actually now have enough product that you can recover it and you can distill it. And this is with material that's not washed and it hasn't been cleaned up in any way. And the next example that I'd like to share with you is the application of some of those novel enzymes. And if you look at the bottom panel, that is a picture of the bacteria fermenting sugar beet pulp that's left over from sucrose or table sugar processing. So you've got this waste stream that now has a lot of sugar, and if you try to ferment that with those yeasts that I told you about, you don't produce very much ethanol. So you need another organism that's able to handle all of the different sugars in that particular biomass. And then we were able to increase the yield further by adding some of those novel enzyme activities. So now the organism can take up little short chains of the sugars, and it can actually secrete some of the enzymes that are needed to help break apart the plant material. So how quickly can we translate research findings into industrially relevant processes? Well, I'm here to tell you, very happy to say that it's happening now, that the research from our labs, from labs all over the world, industrial labs, are really pushing this field forward. And so our new challenge now is, how do we educate a technically skilled workforce to staff this new exploding industry? And so what you're looking at is a photograph of a professional science master's in biomanufacturing and bioprocessing program that we've launched. And a number of these are are popping up. There are a handful in the US, but we work with industry to say, okay, you're moving at the speed of business, and in academia, we don't usually quite move that quickly, but we need to be responsive to your needs for people who can work in this industry. And these industries will be located in rural areas because that's where the biomass is. So we also need training programs at the maybe less sophisticated skill level, and we can put people back to work. And so we also have worked with our school systems to try and maintain some of the energy about science. And I think everybody saw Brittany's talk and we're just astounded at some of the creative potential that we have out there. But she shared with me that her 6th grade teacher pulled her aside and told her to speak to her talents and to not be cowed by the fact that she's smart and she's good in math. And we need to keep singing that song to our children and to our students, and especially our young women. And so we have this little traveling roadshow that was developed by my colleague up there, Dr. Anna Carls, where we actually take the insects out into the school systems, the termites, and the students actually dissect them out, and they get to see the microbes inside. And then you can see in one of the pictures, a little boy, the daddy's kind of looking over like, what are you so excited about? You know, what are you looking at? And so through the children, we educate the parents. And then we have some interactive displays, and we start talking about cellulosic fuels. And so we kind of get at them and in round. And so my message or my challenge is that this transition away from a petroleum-based economy is coming. And if you saw that graph and really grasped what that meant, this is really a transformation in the world's energy infrastructure. This is happening all over the world, not just here. And if you can look at what you have in your community and in your region and your area, if it's a waste or if it's something you can grow and harvest in a sustainable manner and you can collect it, and then you can make a fuel, then it makes sense. It makes full circle sense. And so I challenge you to continue to educate yourself. Don't believe all the myths that are out there about alternative energy. Don't throw out all of biofuels because there are issues with corn ethanol or whatever you produce. There are issues with everything. And if we don't start really looking at petroleum and fossil fuels with the same scrutiny and the same magnifying lens as we do with any kind of alternative, then we're going to be in trouble. So that's my challenge to you, and I thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.